Okay, so I'm just gonna jump right in because
Yeah,
it's
go for
limited
it.
for time. But
Yes.
I mean, I guess at first, can you start by telling me and like our audience who might not be familiar with you
Mm,
about your background and who you are and your work right now?
cool. So I'm working in a university in New Zealand, basically in the area of history mostly, but my research has been in education and history, and in a broad sense, around anything to do with Māori, who's New Zealand's Indigenous people. So that's, I guess, how, in a really broad sense, that's what my research focuses on. Um, Yeah, and I'm currently lecturing, and I have an interest in general in the crossover, I guess, between history and culture and a lot of the identity issues that we see today, just in general. So I read a lot about that anyway, and sort of have done a couple of blog posts on it. And yeah, that's how I think that I ended up at Speak Up for Women.
Yeah, awesome. Um, and I mean, I guess so. At that the event at the Speak Up for Women event, you talked about a paper that you had published,
Mm, mhm.
and it was looking at narratives around, or it was questioning narratives around inherited colonial trauma,
Yeah.
um, which sounds really interesting. I mean, first, before you tell me what happened with the paper,
Mm.
can you tell me a bit about the findings? You know, what was the paper about?
Yeah. So basically, I see a lot of narratives that exist by virtue of people saying it's true rather than necessarily them being grounded in really solid research. And I think we see that a lot in general nowadays with a whole host of things that we're expected to believe just because a whole lot of people say that it's true. So, one of the narratives that exists around Māori in New Zealand, and probably for a lot of Indigenous groups around the world, is that we suffer from we termed in the article inherited colonial trauma, where from colonization we all are traumatized in some way. Now, when you on the surface, people go, "Oh yeah, that makes sense." You know, in a lot of instances, Indigenous peoples present with particular outcomes compared with non-Indigenous peoples. But what people never hear in that statistic is that the majority of Indigenous peoples don't present with that outcome. The majority actually, for example, are not incarcerated or are not failing at school or are not, you know, struggling with mental health issues or so on, like the narrative would suggest. So I started to think, well, how can it be that you can be traumatized by something which has medical implications, right? Um, by something that you haven't experienced, and how can that be passed from generation to generation? It just didn't add up. So I started to think more about that, and also from the sense that if we tell, if you hear every day that you're traumatized by virtue of one aspect of your identity, which necessarily negates everything else about you, it it just seemed like a really dangerous thing to tell someone all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So there were just so many questions that I had about it, and in so many different ways, it just didn't stack up. And I started to talk to regular people on the street, outside of the universities where a lot of this rhetoric comes from. And people, the vast majority of Māori people whom I spoke with, just laughed at the notion that they were traumatized. It just was absurd to them. So, yeah, I started to question it more and using like a psychological framework, I guess, to unpack that idea and to start to think, why is it, where does it come from, and how is this narrative managed to get to the point where it's almost the orthodoxy with very little to back it up.
Yeah, and also what purpose that would serve. As you say, like I think that it's worthwhile to question whether or not telling someone that they have this kind of that they're damaged inherently somehow because of
Hmm.
their past, because of their history, and that the implication is that you can't escape that. It's just there. You can't really help it.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's really interesting. I have not looked into this issue very much at all, so I'm
Hmm.
obviously interested to hear more about what you think about it. But I mean, it does seem like something that probably came out of academia. Is that true?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it fits with a lot of other narratives that you see coming out of academia that are slowly creeping into society in general. So it's very much a victim oppressor narrative again, where anything kind of Western, white, you know, basically inherently of that is necessarily oppressive and oppressing constantly, daily, non-white, non-Western people. And it just doesn't stack up in New Zealand, at least in the context of New Zealand. And when you look at, you know, the range of influences that we have on us as people, the idea that from something that happened in our history, when you look at world history, it's happened all over the place. Why just to that group of people? And it almost suggests that there's something inherently deficient in those people who, you know, you can't sort of overcome something in your past, or it just didn't add up at all. But I think it's coming out of academia. It's linked to elements of that Marxist relationship. I think it's really damaging. And of course now in New Zealand it's influencing things at policy level, where we increasingly hear that a statistic like a lot of Māori are incarcerated, for example, in terms of the proportion of the incarcerated population, not relative to the actual Māori population. The vast majority aren't. But we're hearing things like colonization is to blame for the higher numbers, you know, of Māori who are incarcerated relative to the overall population. And I think that is really dangerous, in that it actually creates this sweeping narrative that assumes everybody's pathway is just destined to be what it is because of something in their distant past that they haven't even experienced themselves. And instead of when we're buying into these narratives, we're not looking for actually the real issues as to why people found themselves, for example, you know, imprisoned at a higher rate than others.
Yeah, I mean, it does sort of, I think it sort of oversimplifies things, of course, and it explains the issues to the general public in a way that I don't think actually makes sense to the general public. So if you start repeating, like, it's because of colonialism, or even, you know, it's because of patriarchy, things like that. You know, I have those same critiques about the language we use in feminism, right? Like, it's because we live in a misogynist culture, or even we live in a rape culture. It's because of imperialism. Like, people don't really understand what that means, and that doesn't translate, and then nobody knows how to address the problem. It's like, oh, well, how do I deal with colonialism?
Exactly. No, you're absolutely right.
Or patriarchy. Like,
it's this weird, like, abstract kind of cloud, you know, nebulous kind of fog thing. Like, how do you address it? And instead of saying, actually, you know, you could take in the instance of some of the issues facing women, or some of the issues facing some Indigenous peoples, to say, oh, it's because of colonization or the patriarchy, then people go, well, what do we do about that? It's this weird kind of strange abstract
and
concept,
also where's what's happening in the middle there? So colonization and then incarceration, and I don't think people are able to make that connection at all. I mean, I don't know that I could make the connection, and I've, you know, studied all this stuff. You know, I was in gender studies, so a lot of, you know, women's studies, gender studies is focused on studying the impacts of colonization and imperialism and Western culture, and all these words that you sort of end up, you know, puking up over and over and over again to get good grades on your essays.
Oh yes, and throw in like hegemony and, you know, systemic or something, and you've got an A. I mean, the thing is that it didn't make sense in the context of world history when you look at, you know, movement of people and so on. Everyone in their past at some point has had an ancestor, for example, that something traumatic has happened to, whether it was at a group level or at a more individual level. Everybody in New Zealand, so in New Zealand history, it didn't make sense because the relationship between, say, Indigenous people and settlers when it was first unfolding was really complex. So it creates this blanket. It was just all negative and all really terrible, and nothing good happened, and that denies Māori agency as well, because there were lots of good things that happened. But people, don't like to hear that because it ruins the narrative. And that's when I think you see history being reshaped to suit a contemporary agenda, and that's what I have an issue with as well.
Yeah. What do you think the contemporary agenda is?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's linked to a whole lot of things. It's linked to, it's this almost anarchist agenda of tearing something down for the sake of tearing something down, rather than understanding that things are often more nuanced and more complex and than we make them out to be. I think that it's also, identity politics plays a huge part in it as well. And I spoke at Speak Up for Women about identity politics and the implications that I think that they have, which are really damaging. And, it positions people as, if you have this ancestry, you must think like this. And then you must also hate these people because these are our enemy, and anything that emerges from this group, we have to tear down. And it's just a really strange kind of narrative I think we see unfolding. And when you question it, in my mind, it just doesn't stack up.
Yeah, and it's also not universal. So it treats Western civilization as though it's representative of global history. So when you start talking about white man, or even like the way that we talk about colonialism and the history of colonialism, and oppressor versus the oppressed, who's marginalized, that looks very different in Canada even than it does in the United States. Never mind the way it might look in, South Asia or something, like somewhere, and any other country. Basically, we all have different histories, and so it's never as simple as like white versus POC, as they call it.
No, yeah.
In social justice warrior language.
Oh, exactly.
As though all people of color are the same and have the same histories too, right? Like
exactly. But it's increasingly being portrayed as this kind of us versus them narrative. And I was at a conference recently where there were people from Canada, actually Indigenous people from Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and parts of Scandinavia, and you could have taken out any of the characters and replaced it with the other, because the language is all the same. And I think it's emerged out of the academy and out of universities, and it's creeping into other parts of society now, where it's kind of putting all these people into groups, and then the groups are all just weaponized against each other, and it's pretty awful.
Yeah.
Especially when, like you say, people's identities and histories are complex. And there was movement all over the world. There was good things and bad things that happened in history, and to suggest that you're sort of traumatized by them, and then you're almost in a way that your existence and your pathway and trajectory is determined because of that, is so, I think, crippling. Mm-hmm. I would never tell a child that every day, because you're Māori or because you're an Indigenous, you're traumatized, and I don't think anyone would. And the question is, why wouldn't you? Because I think we know what that would do to that child's psyche. So if we wouldn't tell an individual that, why would we accept it on a mass level when it just doesn't stack up at all?
It's interesting because I've thought about this issue a lot in terms of being working class and what that did to what I thought I could achieve, and like my relationship to money and my relationship to things like property. Because not that I don't think that it's not useful to talk about the working class and to talk about that as a class system wherein there really are people who hold power, over working class people. But at the same time, it impacts what you sort of think that you have access to and what you think you can achieve in a really big way. And that's part of why people with wealth or people with money, people from even the middle and upper class, achieve more than people, I think, from the lower class do, because they think they can. They've never in their brain told themselves, oh, I can never, I can never buy a house, I can never own property, like I can never have this nice thing, I don't have access to whatever. And there are, of course, systemic barriers, like big time. I'm not saying anyone can just do anything. Certainly, like if you don't have money or your family doesn't have money, it's going to be significantly more difficult for you to access things like a home.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it does affect your relationships. It affects your relationships to other people, to society, to, it totally impacts your decisions and your choices. So it's sort of a tough thing to navigate because there's truth on both ends, but,
There definitely is. And I think that truth comes down to individual experience. When you think about how complex it is to be a human, if you like, all the different influences in our life, and when you think about the combination of factors that have to go into achieving a particular outcome, the idea that the sole determinant of your outcome is your ethnicity is just so unnuanced, I think, and just really oversimplifies what it means to be a human and to exist in this world that we're in, where to suggest that everyone who, for example, has a particular ethnicity or grew up in a particular class or whatever the case may be is going to be the same, it's just a really just uncritical, I think, analysis of things. But that's increasingly what we hear.
And that we can't possibly really understand each other. You can't possibly understand somebody who is of a different race or different class, and, men and women can't really understand each other, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's crazy. I mean, as I mentioned in my talk at Speak Up for Women, we're all so much more alike than we are different, and we can connect on a multitude of things. But when we're not only told that we can't connect, but when connecting with other people becomes almost a betrayal of your group, I think that's when we have a real problem.
Yeah.
And that's increasingly what we're seeing, I think, in a lot of different areas. And it's just really unhelpful, and it starts to impact on our ability to have a civil conversation, much less debate issues that we really need to discuss.
Yeah. And I mean, because of my history is in the left and in feminism, so my critiques are often almost always centered around the left and feminism, just because that's what I have experience with, not necessarily because I don't think it happens in other areas. It may well.
Yeah.
But, for me, in feminism, one of the things that's frustrated me a lot is this idea that, we can't, because I have a lot of close male friends, and I value them just as much as I value my female friends, and they're great. They're obviously not shitty people, otherwise I wouldn't be friends with them. But I hear a lot, it's almost like some women who've been immersed in feminism have developed this idea that you can't trust any man and you can't relate to other men, and, you wouldn't want to be around men, and, you don't want to have male friends. I mean, living with a male partner is always going to be sort of fraught. And, it often is fraught. Like, in my experience, it has certainly been fraught.
Yeah, likewise.
but at the same time, it's because of these friendships that I have with men that I think that I do understand men on a certain level, and I can have honest conversations, which is really helpful, even if it's just in terms of understanding, why men use pornography, or why men relate to women in certain ways. Even if there's, bad things that you hear in those conversations are really worthwhile in terms of us understanding one another. And then if you talk about those things, you're in a position to say, well, this is how porn culture has impacted me, and, does it impact you in this way or whatever? And the lack of conversation, like the unwillingness to talk, is what really bugs me, because it's like, well, I don't understand how we expect to get anywhere or change anything if we're not going to talk and treat each other like human beings who, are struggling in our own ways, even if we're not all making the right good choices all the time.
Of course, absolutely. And increasingly we see that you can't have those conversations because people are painted as if there's characteristics of our identity which are often like a circumstance of our birth. I mean, I didn't ask to be born a woman or ask to be born a man. You are one or the other, and you kind of that's how you then live your life. I didn't ask to have dark hair or green eyes. It's just part of who you are, right? These quite arbitrary characteristics that are randomly assigned, I guess. And then to suggest that those are then what determines who you can be friends with, what you must think, how your outcomes in life, everything about your existence, I think it's actually really depressing, you know, to think that we would just be limited to that. I think it's our experiences as people are so much more complex and far richer than that. Mm-hmm. So, and I mean, I experienced it, the article, having questioned those things and putting forward like a good argument, and I thought that was sound. It followed all the right conventions. The reason it got trashed wasn't because the articles weren't good, but because I wrote it with a white man.
So what happened? So just to back up like a little bit. So you published the paper, and then what happened?
So then I shared it to an online research group to get feedback on it, because like I genuinely was interested in what people had to say. Like you, I think if we can't talk to one another, have these difficult conversations, hear where somebody else is coming from, you know, what's the point? We either just exist in echo chambers or we just hate each other, basically. So I was really interested in what people thought, and if the argument was defeated, I would totally change my position. Or I would hope that maybe some people would take on board what we were saying in the article and then maybe shift their position accordingly. Instead, so the article I shared there, and it was removed twice. The first time it was removed by another Indigenous woman and her reason was, I quote, research by Pākehā, which is our word in New Zealand for white man, research by Pākehā men is not welcome here. And it's put in brackets, even if it's co-authored by a Māori woman. So I felt like completely dismissed, and my contribution to it didn't matter. His contribution was ignored in the sense of what he was saying, and these two characteristics of who he is, that he's white and he's a man, meant that everything he had to say was not worth considering. So I then reposted the article, and then it was removed again. The usual social media pylon came on. I was told I was supporting white supremacy. I had a colonized mind. I was on this blacklist of dangerous people. I was really dangerous to Māori. And then the whole conversation was shut down by the person who took it off. So, I mean, my workplace was called. The funders of my research were called to stop funding it just because of that.
Because it was co-authored by a man, or because of the actual content of the paper also?
Actually, that's a fair question. Probably the content of the paper was controversial as well, in that it was definitely questioning the orthodoxy and questioning what we've accepted, I think, really blindly, this narrative that just doesn't really make sense. And so certainly the paper itself was going to be causing a little bit of a stir. But the reason given was because he was a white male. But I think that was to avoid addressing the issues in the article, because I think that it put up a serious challenge to the orthodoxy. But, you know, instead of defending their position, they used this other method, which we see so often now, to shut down debate, which is you've got the wrong characteristics to be commenting on this stuff, therefore shut down.
Right. So it becomes, it's a way to avoid engaging with the content, avoid engaging with whatever's saying, because it's like, well, you're a white man, so sit down, shut up, or you're a cis woman, so sit down, shut up.
Yes, exactly. All of that stuff. So, and we see it so often, you know, it becomes like kind of the biggest victim is necessarily right. And it's no longer about what we're saying and the validity of the argument put forward, but who's saying it. Mm-hmm. If you even have a right to comment. I mean, Speak Up for Women experienced that with a comment that their feminism was white feminism, and they weren't allowed to comment on gender issues in New Zealand because one of the spokespersons is a white female, and she wasn't on the right land. She wasn't on her land. I mean, that's ludicrous that that would be used as a valid response in a debate about really serious issues. It blows my mind.
Yeah. And I mean, and that, yeah, one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was this trend that I've been noticing around kind of like what I consider to be the fetishization of trauma, the fetishization of marginalization, the fetishization of victimhood. So, to the point where, okay, so, the context that I've seen it happen often in, again, I'm certain that it happens in all sorts of contexts, in, trans activism, for example, where trans activists are claiming that feminists are, endangering them or even perpetrating violence against them, which is, of course, like completely untrue. And generally that, that this is what trans activists say, that trans people are being hunted all the time. There's just this constant violence against them all the time. And that's also not true. I mean, the reality is that the people subject to violence the most are men.
Yeah, you're right. Well, that's an inconvenient truth. You're not allowed to say that.
Which doesn't mean that, there's not, other forms of violence that happen on account of oppression or sexism or marginalization that are perpetrated against people who are from marginalized populations, specifically because they're from marginalized populations, etc. Right. But it's like, for a lot of these people who I think are often college students, like, so when I explain this all the time, so I'm sure I don't need to explain it to you, but just for people listening, when I say trans activists, I don't necessarily mean trans people or trans identified people. I mean people who are advocating for this gender identity ideology.
Yes.
So who are often college students, university students. So it's like, fairly privileged people, really. People who have access to university education, often people who are middle class, upper class, they're people living in Vancouver, which, if you're living in Vancouver, you're doing okay on a global level. Which is, again, not just, I mean, there's tons of people who are struggling in Vancouver, but not these people so much.
I totally agree with you. And even the fact we have to put all these caveats around it, like, we're not saying this, we're not saying that.
I know.
Like, because I get it, yeah.
Yeah, but so, there, and then it's like you're, these people, it's like you want to be victimized. Like, you desperately want to have come from some sort of marginalized population. Like, it's like you're seeking out oppression, and I don't understand that. I was like, why would you want to have been traumatized or victimized? Like, that's not a good thing. Like,
no, it's not. And it's funny what you say about, I mean, that it's coming from college students, because I see a lot of the whole thing is part of this like anarchist agenda, right? So often people who are TRAs in the sense that they're the activist types and not necessarily identify as trans, but they're also often anti the West, they're anti anything white, they're anti a lot of things male, they're anti, just a whole host of things, right? That just feels it's part of tearing it down for the sake of tearing it down, rather than actually being able to articulate what it is that is wrong with whatever they have issues with. And also, while I see them often benefiting from the things that they seem to want to tear down. So like you say, people who are college students, there's a certain amount of, I guess, privilege, for want of a better word, that they have been able to access in order to be in college in the first place. What I also saw with a lot of the academics who are, spreading the narrative about trauma is these are women or men, often women actually, with PhDs. I mean, the idea that they are traumatized by colonization when they're sitting as associate professors earning 6 figures a year, it just didn't stack up against the narrative. And to me, it's almost insulting to people who genuinely struggle with issues in their life that may or may not have stemmed from colonization. I mean, I would question that anyway, but it doesn't make sense, and it's just it just seems to me to be really flawed.
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny as you notice who does that thing of listing their marginalized identities over and over and over, and who doesn't? Because, you know, there's a lot of people who you'll see, you know, on Twitter, but then also I think they do it when they do their academic presentations and whatever too, or in their activist groups or whatever it is. And they list off their many marginalized identities and then list off their pronouns and so on and so forth. But, you know, and then, you know, and then there's plenty of people who do have marginalized identities, who could very easily list off all of their hardships and trauma and their background, which is rooted in, you know, a history of, you know, colonization or whatever it is, who choose not to list off the identities as a means to give their voices more weight or their words more weight.
Of course.
And so it makes me, at this point, having witnessed this for so long, it makes me more mistrustful of the people who do it, who do use it.
Oh, yeah. Because I think it's about some sort of agenda. Like I said, it's kind of clinging to these factors about themselves in order to score points. I think often in order to position, there's an element of power in there as well. They're positioning themselves as being more right or more entitled to be right because of some historic marginalization. And now we're kind of trying to even up the playing field, I guess. I think that the word fetishization, it's hard to get your tongue around, is such a good way to put it because you see it so often. And, you know, kind of the person who's the most oppressed or the most, you know, I've seen tests even where you can like tick how many things that you have in like the oppressed column and how many you have in the privileged column. And these are coming out of universities to get some kind of idea of your privilege in life. And I mean, it's just crazy. It's so crazy that we are dividing people into these arbitrary things about themselves that then is meant to determine everything that you're capable of. And one of the things we talked about in the article as well is this idea of ressentiment comes out of Nietzsche's work. But it kind of traps you into this blame victim cycle where if anything goes wrong in your world, well, it's not your fault. It's this weird thing that happened way back in history, or it's the fact that you're oppressed by the system around you, or, you know, it just creates like a, really undermines individual agency for a start and puts you in a really dangerous position, I think, in terms of actually taking control of your life when you constantly have the ability to blame other people.
Yeah.
You know, and that's not to say, like we both keep saying, that people don't have challenges that aren't, of course, through any fault of their own, of course, but so many people have that. So many people do. And I think it's really wrong of us to assume that just because you are a certain ethnicity or a certain sex or a certain sexuality, whatever, that you're necessarily, your problems just kind of evaporate on that basis. It's really kind of not fair, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, the reality is that what we should probably be doing is approaching people with the assumption that we don't know their histories and we don't know what people have been through. Like, I think that would probably be a healthier way to relate to people is, A, by not stereotyping people based on how they look. That should be like totally. A basic thing. But then also, like, you know, you don't know what someone's been through, and they're not gonna announce their entire history to you, whether there's abuse in that history or not. You know, and they're not gonna announce all of their experiences to you, and we shouldn't be making those kinds of assumptions because that'll limit how we engage with them, really.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think it only perpetuates the problem. I mean, the irony of this is that so many of these things are done in the name of tolerance and inclusion and diversity and so on, but it's one very specific kind of diversity and it's one very specific kind of inclusion where you're sort of almost reversing what people would argue has been a particular power imbalance to create a new power imbalance. I mean, it's just it's a really, and then to think that the outcome would be any different. I think that, you know, we've got some sort of, increasingly we're becoming more politically polarized, I guess, particularly in the West I'm talking. And when I see people, you know, getting shut down and totally cancelled and annihilated for something really quite innocuous in what they've said, I think, wow, you're just pushing people into the more extreme, I guess, schools of thinking, instead of creating some kind of connection and bridge. We're just, I think, pushing people apart.
Yeah.
I mean, I just saw online the other day that someone got like annihilated for saying that they don't like Indian food in terms of the taste, nothing else around it. He didn't like the spices, and that was like, you know, he's been called like a racist, white, like evil man, you know. And it, I mean, that's ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
When's it going to stop? And I just don't know where it's going to stop.
Yeah. The tribalism is a thing that I've been interested in. And I mean, because on one hand, like, I think that it makes sense that you might want to identify with a tribe, or identify with, I don't know, people who understand you, or, you know, definitely be part of a community in any case. Of course humans want to be part of communities.
Absolutely.
But then at the same time, we're seeing tribalism having a really negative impact on culture and politics and things like that. I don't know if you've thought about that much, but if you, I mean, do you think that tribalism is inherently a bad thing, or is it just the way that it's manifested itself today? Like,
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that we're social creatures, right? I think we're designed to be kind of part of some sort of group, whether that's like a family unit, a group of friends, different clubs and things we may join. We're constantly interacting with one another. I think that it's morphed, though, from that into related to these circumstances of our birth, whether we're white or whether we're female or whether we're gay or whatever we may be. And therefore, from that comes all of your political viewpoints, the other people you're allowed to be friends with, what you are allowed to comment on or not comment on. It's just kind of taken on a life of its own and morphed into this insane kind of like almost box that people are then contained in, and then of course all of these groups are then pitted against one another. And if you break the, I guess, so-called manifesto of your group, then you are in big trouble, because they don't really like dissent, I guess, from their own. But and so then when it becomes not only difficult to have conversations with other people, but wrong to even want to have the conversation, then we're in trouble, I think. You know, it's not helpful at all. I mean, you get people here in New Zealand where we don't have, in our political system at least, like extreme right, but language is so key to all of this, where words and definitions are constantly shifting in order to suit narratives. What's racist on one hand for one group can't be racist for another group because of historical power relations or whatever. That's never been the definition of racism, but it shifts to suit what I keep talking about, this contemporary agenda of kind of anarchy and chaos, I think. They also, you know, things like the word violence, you know, it's literally violence to misgender me. It's literally killing me if you don't think that you can change your biological sex. I mean, that's absurd. And I think we need to stop like with such like hyperbolic language where it just doesn't, it's actually not. And to everyone to kind of like, I don't know, just get some perspective.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, I guess, and I think that kind of touches on the cultishness of political movements these days. And that, you know, what I've seen as, you know, pretty culty behavior in various political movements has made me question a lot, you know, including my own involvement again in like the left and in feminism, and how I've engaged with people in the past, like groups deemed enemies of the group and things like that, and really, you know, changed the way I engage and changed my perspective in a lot of ways. And to the point where I don't really care about attaching myself to labels like the left or even feminism, because I just want the freedom to be able to think independently, and I don't want to be put in a box. Like, it's like, you know, well, you can't ask that if you're a feminist, or you can't talk to that person if you're part of the left, or whatever it is. I mean, do you think that, like, again, do you think this is something that's inherently part of, like, is any political movement gonna end up being kind of culty, or do you think that there's something going on with our political movements now where ideology has become so rigid and we're so fearful of stepping out of line, or of self-critique, or critiquing the group, or whatever?
Yeah, I haven't studied political movements. I think some have definitely been cultish in the past and totally like authoritarian, and there's elements of that now. I think that these have emerged out of the universities, and eventually, unfortunately, they've spilled out into society and have are influencing policy. They're certainly in New Zealand at least, they're influencing education, even right from primary school through into universities. And I think that, I would hope that we can find some way to remain free thinkers. And that's why I intentionally don't use the label, for example, I'm a Māori woman, therefore I have to say this, because I'm actually of mixed heritage for a start, but also I don't like the implications that comes with, because nowadays more and more saying, like, using those, 4 words means people then go, oh, in assign a whole lot of things, like I must think, and I must therefore vote a particular way, or I must therefore not like these particular people, or I must have this in my past, and so on. And it's just a really, I think, suffocating way to be. And there are things, like, I've always been a left voter, and there was once upon a time in my more naive days, I think, when I would have just thought it was like treachery to talk to somebody who voted for the right in New Zealand, when all of our political parties are more left than the Democrats in America. So that's putting it into perspective. Yeah. And I just sort of thought that was the worst thing you could do. And when I started to realize that we're all so much more alike than we are different in terms of our existence as humans, it just makes those arbitrary factors about ourselves really silly. And not to diminish people's identities, because, like you say, people do want to belong and be part of some sort of group, and also may find them having Māori heritage as being really the sole determinant of their identity, and that's fine. But equally, others may not see that, and I think that we shouldn't kind of paint everyone just in the same light, and understand that we all have such rich and complex experiences, and we can't just assume things about one another, and from that assumption decide that you just hate anyone who's like that. It's so, it just doesn't add up to do that. But we're seeing it so much more, I think, and then of course it has implications in other areas. Like, then we start talking about censorship and people being deplatformed and cancelled and harassed, and their workplaces called, and that's not okay. It's really, it doesn't create the so-called harmonious, inclusive society that they ostensibly want. The evil they.
Yeah.
It just, I don't know. It frustrates me, and you hear it so often. I was at that conference I was at a couple of weeks ago. This person said, that she's only nice to people that she doesn't like, and that's why all the white people at her work think that she's really nice. And I just thought, wow, like, I know. I was like, okay, but if you, it
doesn't make any sense, but okay.
No, right? I know, and everyone went, yeah. I was like, okay, because if you reverse that statement for a start, all hell would break loose, right? And kind of rightly so. Like, it's pretty fucking racist, but also, like, it's just a crazy thing to think, that you just hate people by virtue of, like, their skin pigmentation.
Or that it's weird. Good, like, if you're kind of like championing being mean to other people, like, if it's like, and I don't know, and I think you're right, actually, that these kind of activist groups or these kinds of academics or whatever do that a lot, where it's like, oh, like, I did this to this dude or to like a turf or like I'm just mean to
Yeah.
like all men now or whatever
Yeah.
it is. I'm be mean to cis people, like, and you're like, why? Like, and you're like, yeah, way to go. And it's like, well, you shouldn't just be mean to people for no reason.
No, didn't we learn that in like kindergarten? I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
It's a bizarre thing. And of course, when the tables are turned, I mean, in reverse, it's not okay. And it's not okay in any situation, but to be like, have so much vitriol where, you know, you're turning up to events with like guillotines and stuff, and then, but you're equally saying, please don't use these words with me because it's literally violence, and here you are with this guillotine encouraging people to walk on it. I mean, the hypocrisy is unbelievable. It blows my mind that, you know, that this is what you think is going to create this so-called peaceful, harmonious society. You know?
I mean, I don't know what they think, because I can't imagine that, like, it makes no sense that being mean to people or threatening people or bullying them or calling them names will get them on side. It doesn't make any sense that that would have like a positive impact on society if that's what you're looking for. I mean, I can only assume that much of it has to do with virtue signaling to their friends, or like you're going to be mean to somebody so you can go to your academic conference and announce that you were mean to somebody, or whatever, that you were nice to somebody to trick them somehow.
Yeah.
I don't know where I don't know where the anger comes from. Like, I kind of don't buy it. Like, it's like, you know, at these protests, I mean, at the protests against me in Toronto outside the Toronto Public Library, I watched some of the videos after, and these kids, I mean, a lot of them were, you know, college kids or whatever. Not all of them. They were totally adults there also. But they just seemed so full of rage and hate and anger, and I can't figure out where that comes from.
I don't know either. And the article talked a little bit about that on the edge, I guess, about this idea of ressentiment or resentment, I guess, but it's sort of quite a bit sharper edged than resentment. And the blame and the trap that you create for yourself when you honestly think the whole world is against you and that systems have been set up necessarily to get you. And it's, I don't know where it comes from either, but it's really vicious. And the irony is that the arguments can be used in reverse. So someone can say, well, you make me feel really unsafe if you don't believe that you can change your biological sex, for example, therefore I'm going to shut you down and deplatform you and harass you, as if we can't then say, well, actually that kind of makes me feel unsafe too, like your behavior. So how can we find some way of hearing each other and actually where it's not, where we can have a conversation and discussion about these really serious issues. But in this day and age, the act of even wanting to have the conversation is the hateful act. So it's getting more and more that you can barely even think anything. I mean, I saw someone the other day saying somebody may use the right pronouns, but you can hear the quotation marks in their voice. So, I mean, that's just looking to be the victim, like you say, that fetishization of victimhood and oppression. And
so what does that, oh, I see, they're mad that like somebody is doing what they want them to do by using their correct pronouns, but they're mad that they think that this person doesn't actually buy into it.
Yeah.
Well, and it's like, well, what more do you want? Like, most people don't buy into it. Sorry, but you can't force people to think things that they don't think. You know,
you can't.
But it's not enough for you to bully the entire population into pretending that your pronouns are whatever you've decided they are.
Yeah, I know, and also that, I mean, I think there's something really creepy in like forcing people to say something that they don't really believe, you know. And I mean, it's emperor's new clothes, right? Everyone's standing around going, yeah, sure, because no one wants to be like cancelled and annihilated by people. But I mean, for the most part, I think the vast majority think it's not right, it's not real. But what intrigued me about this statement about, yeah, they're doing what I've asked them to do, but I can hear the quotation marks in their voice. I mean, you just cannot win. You're never going to be like woke enough or do enough virtue signaling or be inclusive enough, because one of the other things that the article talked about was it isn't about any kind of solution to any of this. It's about the constant fight. So I think that's part of it, and why definitions shift, why new forms of violence are created so often, because it isn't about any kind of peaceful resolution and harmonious society that they speak of, but rather about this constant struggle and anarchy and chaos and anger and resentment. And it's just so unhealthy. And I don't know what drives it. I really don't. I mean, a lot of it, I think, is some indoctrination in the universities, especially in like the humanities and social sciences. I've been to some classes over time, particularly when I was in the States, and was just gobsmacked by what was being taught. You know, and you and I both know that we can write an A+ essay by using all the right language.
Yeah.
You know, and how to do that and how to get those kind of grades.
There's a formula.
There is a formula. All of the hegemony and systemic oppression and, you know, lateral violence or whatever, and voila.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's crazy.
And I mean, I guess,
world.
So there has to be some kind of investment in the legitimacy of those faculties too, right? So they have to all reinforce each other's narratives and pretend that they're all saying something meaningful and interesting, because otherwise the whole house of cards falls apart.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's partly why the article wasn't addressed in terms of the issues that it raised, but rather other tactics were used to shut it down. Because and to me, if you are using, like, if you hear something that's total rubbish, by and large people go, "Ugh, that's rubbish," and they kind of dismiss it and walk away. You might be a little annoyed, but that's the extent of it. But if you're so angry that you just want to shut it down, you've got to ask yourself why. Like, what is it? If your argument is a solid, valid argument, it will stand up to scrutiny. And if you don't want it to be scrutinized, you've got to ask yourself why not.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that with so many things these days, the tendency to just shut it down rather than to put forward a valid response or argument to something is really key to the validity of the argument in the first place. You know?
Do you have to get going? Are you okay? Or
let me double check. I'm okay.
I mean, because we could end it now, or there's a couple more things I wanted to ask you, but either way is fine with me.
Oh no, I'm good.
You're good? Okay.
Yeah, we're good.
So I know that you have written about diversity, which, again, is really not something that I thought about all that much until recently, and then started realizing that people were critiquing diversity, and it was like, oh, weird, because, you know, diversity sort of seems like this universally positive term. They're like, who wouldn't want diversity?
Yeah, I know, right?
But it's also one of those words that's been like, it's been adopted into every single institution, into, you know, the political arena, obviously into academia, and I don't even know. I mean, well, why don't you tell me, like, what your critiques of diversity are?
I mean, I think it's not to throw the whole thing out. Like, I think that that there's value in diversity in the sense that it's nice to mix with people from other backgrounds and to hear different people's stories. But equally, what I think it's morphed into is this, where it's diversity in very superficial sense. So, you know, it's taken to mean now, I guess, having more people of color on boards, for example, more women on boards, more perhaps, you know, LGBTQ people on boards, and so on. And from that is diversity is achieved, right? But you're not allowed to deviate from whatever approved narrative there is. So diversity of thought doesn't come into question. And I realized this at the university recently. I was at another university giving a talk about something, and I'd written something that, again, I guess was questioning things. And I was told that I shouldn't kind of question the orthodoxy that in the universities that won't get you far. I mean, I thought that was exactly what you were meant to do in the university, to try and, have some sort of truth emerge. And just before that, I'd heard the vice chancellor, who's the president, I think you call them, of the university, stand up and say that the university was committed to diversity. But here I was thinking, well, only superficial diversity, where we all have to actually think the same, but you're just box ticking to get this idea of diversity past the diversity police,
Right.
And so, and of course it's selective diversity. Like, nobody's ever saying, hey, let's hear more from these kind of fringe groups. So it's kind of the approved people that we'd like to include, but we're not necessarily including everyone and allowing people to have a range of views that they're able to express. So, and I'm not talking, hateful extremist views or anything like that, but just something that offers a counter to everything that we're so encouraged or forced to think these days.
Yeah, and I think, have some disagreement.
Yeah, and that's okay. But increasingly, you're not allowed to have that. And so on the one hand, I see universities, other organizations saying, the diversity, inclusion and equity officer, without really unpacking what those mean and if it's even possible. I mean, equity is another one. We hear people saying, let's create this kind of absolutely even playing field. And that's impossible when you think that the same person isn't equal to themselves on any given day. So how can it be possible to create absolute equality across, everyone's outcomes? It's really bizarre.
Yeah. And I sort of guess, I mean, what's the point of having, say, a diverse panel, for example, a panel that represents different identities, whatever it may be, if everybody agrees with each other?
Exactly. That's exactly my point.
I'd rather have a more monolithic panel where there was different opinions and different experiences and people could, butt heads and debate a little bit and challenge one another.
Absolutely, because otherwise, I mean, to me, that's not diversity. It's just really superficial. And diversity in that respect is celebrated, and that's great. But diversity of thought is not only not celebrated, it's actually suppressed. If you deviate from the norm, especially in universities, it's been my experience at least, it doesn't end well for you.
Yeah.
And also, so much stuff I think these days becomes orthodoxy just by repetition. So people don't unpack these ideas and say, well, hang on a minute, what does this even mean? Is it a good idea? It may well be. How do we do this? Is it possible to achieve? But it just becomes what we do without us even really thinking a lot about it.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, at the same time, of course, the concept of diversity is important because it is true that for a really long time we kind of did in the West mostly only hear from white men, especially when it comes to the media or panels and in academia. So it's that sort of thing is really important. But yeah, I think it's come to a place where, like you say, it should include diversity of thought and diversity of experience and diversity in background and not just representing various, sexes or colors or whatever it is.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. So I'm not saying we shouldn't have sort of different groups represented or to diversify a panel in terms of people's ethnicity or sexuality, gender, whatever. But let's allow those people to have different views rather than thinking that you now have the gay view represented.
Yeah.
You now have the women's view represented as if all women think the same. Yeah. And here's the woman's view, and here's a woman to just parrot that view.
Exactly.
That's what I think it's become.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's frustrating to me. But of course, if you question diversity, then people think, oh, you're advocating for white supremacy. I'm like, wow, that was a big leap.
Well, I mean, anyone who diverges from correct leftist thought is advocating white supremacy, as we
pretty
both
much
know. So
yeah, we do. Yeah, totally. I know. Slippery slope.
I wanted to ask you about this. It sort of seems sort of off topic, but it is related to what we've been talking about. I wanted to ask you what you thought about land acknowledgements, because I think that I mean, in Canada, particularly in BC, land acknowledgements are a really big thing. So at most kind of like if you have an event in a university, you'll hear a land acknowledgement. Most like progressive or feminist events, there's a land acknowledgement, and I think that you guys do the same thing in New Zealand because of the history there, same with the history in BC. And I guess, I mean, to me, I'm annoyed by everything that seems like virtue signaling to me, so I find it a bit annoying and tedious at this point, and I've talked to lots of other women, including, you know, Indigenous women or women of color, who also, you know, find it irritating and phony. But I mean, I'm not Indigenous, so I don't know, you know, it may well be very meaningful and important to people, but I don't, I'm not sure, I'm curious to know if you think that it's purposeful or meaningful, or what you think about that.
I mean, I think that I actually wrote another article sort of that touched on this kind of stuff called Playing Cultures. That was the title of the article. And how these land acknowledgements, for example, they happen to a degree in New Zealand, but we often refer to like the land that we sort of descended from. But certainly I've been in Canada and America and Australia as well, where land acknowledgements are very key. And actually in Australia, I found it kind of, I would almost feel maybe patronized if I was an Indigenous Australian, because the phrase that you repeat is exactly the same every time. So it becomes this kind of, okay, done that, tick, and then move on to the real business of the day is then what it feels like, which of course then I think there's a dismissive element in that as well. I mean, I think it's performance, and that was that idea around playing cultures. It's this kind of performance element to it. It makes people feel like they're being inclusive and all and woke and whatever else they want to be, virtue signaling and so on. For some people, it may mean something. If somebody stands up and doesn't acknowledge the land that they're standing on, and they happen to be where I'm from, does it bother me? Absolutely not. You know, they can say and do what they like. It really doesn't. And I've also very tentatively, because this is like a minefield, but question the idea of the word or the concept of indigeneity as well, not to undermine the fact that that there are people who have connection to land and the different cultures and experiences that people have, but more that the term Indigenous is politicized now as well, where it's become kind of a code, if you like, for not white. Because there are, of course, Indigenous white people in the world, but you never really see them at the UN, you know, Council for Indigenous or UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues and so on. And why not? Because, again, I think that, you know, there's that political element to it where it's kind of white and then Indigenous. But many times they can actually be the same thing. They're not mutually exclusive. So,
right.
Yeah. That's probably another conversation.
Yeah, definitely. That's what we can talk about.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, I mean, to me, I think there's an element now of land acknowledgements or people in New Zealand acknowledging landmarks that they have some affinity to as being like an expectation that if you don't do it, it's more indicates something rather than, or is indicative of something, I should say, rather than you actually doing it. Because if you do it, because people are like, oh yeah, there's that thing that we're so used to hearing now. Yeah. That do we even think about what it really means, or are we just performing and ticking this, you know, cultural virtue signaling box?
Yeah. Cool. Well, it was really great to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise. I know. I hope that last bit made sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and it was great to meet you through speak up for women. And
I know, what an experience. It was such a great night. Let's talk again though, that was fun.
Definitely. Thank you so much again for your time.
No problem. I'll catch up with you soon.
Okay, have a good night.
Okay, you too.
Bye.
Bye.